You almost didn't open this, and that matters more than you think, because something in you paused, even if just for a second, like those quiet moments late at night when the room is still, but your mind keeps running, replaying things you can't quite explain, wondering why certain doors didn't open, why that one opportunity slipped through your hands, why things that felt so close suddenly went silent. And you told yourself it was just bad timing, or maybe you weren't ready, but deep down it didn't feel random, did it? It felt like something shifted without warning, like you were moving forward and then suddenly held back, and you couldn't see what changed, only that everything slowed down, and maybe you brushed it off during the day, staying busy, pushing through, acting like nothing was wrong. But then it came back into quiet, that feeling that something unseen was happening around you, something you couldn't control or fully understand, like when you reached for your phone, without thinking, scrolling with no real intention. And somehow you ended up here, not because you planned it, not because you searched for it, but because something in you recognized a signal before your mind caught up. And that's the part most people ignore, that subtle pull, that quiet interruption, that moment where everything else fades just enough for you to notice something different. Because the truth is, not everyone feels that. Not everyone stops. Not everyone listens. And you've probably been telling yourself lately that you're falling behind, that you missed your chance, that other people are moving ahead while you're stuck in place, watching things not work out the way you expected, watching plans shift, watching time pass without clear answers. And it's exhausting, trying to make sense of something that doesn't explain itself, trying to stay patient when nothing seems to be moving, trying to trust when all you feel is distance. But what if this wasn't you losing momentum? What if this pause wasn't empty? What if something was actually being redirected quietly, without noise, without announcement, without you seeing it yet? Because sometimes the most important shifts don't come with clarity right away. They come with confusion first, with silence, with that strange sense that something is off, but not wrong. And if you felt that recently, if something in your life has slowed down just when you thought it would finally speed up, then this moment right here isn't as random as it looks. It's connected to that feeling you couldn't explain, that pause you didn't understand. And the part of you that didn't scroll past this without a second thought, that part of you already knows something is different now. Even if you can't fully see it yet, you have probably noticed that it has not been one single moment, but a series of small, almost unnoticeable shifts, like things just slightly out of place, like arriving 5 minutes too late to something that might have changed everything, or checking your phone and seeing a message that never came, and you told yourself it was nothing, just coincidence, just life being unpredictable. But then it happened again in a different way, a plan that seemed certain suddenly changing, a conversation that did not go the way you expected, a door that looked open quietly closing without explanation. And each time you tried to move forward like it did not matter, like you were still in control, but deep down it started to build into something heavier, a quiet confusion you could not shake. Because it was not just one thing, it was a pattern. And patterns are harder to ignore, especially when they start touching the parts of your life you care about the most. And maybe there was a night recently when you sat alone, maybe on the edge of your bed or in your car after a long day, staring at nothing in particular, just feeling that strange mix of frustration and exhaustion, wondering how you ended up here, wondering why things that used to feel clear now feel uncertain. And you might have thought about going back, retracing your steps, questioning if you made a wrong decision somewhere along the way, because that is what your mind does when it cannot find a clear answer. It looks for something to blame, something to fix, something to change. But what if there was nothing you did wrong? What if the reason you cannot find the mistake is because there is no mistake to find? And that is what makes this so difficult to accept, because it feels like losing control, like being held in a moment that refuses to move. And the more you try to push through it, the more resistance you feel, like trying to walk into a strong wind that keeps slowing you down no matter how hard you try. And that resistance can make you doubt everything, your timing, your choices, even yourself. And yet there is still that quiet part of you that has not fully given up, the part that keeps noticing these moments, keeps remembering them, keeps asking why they feel connected even when you cannot explain how. And that part of you is important because it is paying attention in a way that goes beyond logic, beyond what you can measure or control. And even now as you listen to this, something in you is not just hearing the words but feeling them. like they are touching something you have been trying to ignore, something that has been there for longer than you want to admit. And maybe you have been calling it confusion, or bad luck, or just a rough season. But what if it is something else entirely? Something that has been quietly shaping your path without asking for your understanding first. And then there was that moment you cannot quite forget, not because it was dramatic or obvious, but because it felt slightly off in a way you could not explain at the time. Like the day you were supposed to hear back about something you had been waiting on for weeks, checking your phone more than you wanted to admit, telling yourself to stay calm, to not overthink it. But as the hours passed, nothing came. No message, no call, just silence stretching longer than expected. And you remember how you tried to brush it off, maybe even telling yourself that it was not meant to be that important anyway. But later that night, when everything slowed down, when the noise of the day finally faded, that feeling came back stronger, that quiet question sitting in your chest, asking why it felt like something almost happened but did not. And what made it harder was that it was not the first time, because similar moments had been stacking up. Small interruptions, slight delays, things not lining up the way they should have, and each time you adjusted, you adapted, you kept moving, but something inside you started to get tired, not physically, but emotionally, like you were constantly recalibrating without ever getting clear direction. And maybe you even started to wonder if you were the problem, if you were missing something obvious, if you were not seeing what everyone else seemed to understand so easily. Because from the outside, everything probably still looked fine. You were still showing up, still doing what you were supposed to do, still trying. But inside there was this growing distance between where you thought you would be and where you actually were. And that gap can be one of the hardest things to carry, because it is invisible to everyone else, but very real to you. And there might have been a moment recently when you almost made a different choice. Almost said yes to something that did not feel completely right. Just because you were tired of waiting, tired of feeling stuck, tired of not knowing what was next. And for a second it seemed like the easier path, like at least it would move things forward. But something stopped you. Not loudly, not forcefully, just a quiet hesitation, a pause that made you second guess it. And you might not have understood it then. You might have even been frustrated by it, wondering why you could not just move on like everyone else. But that pause matters more than it seemed, because it shows that even in the middle of confusion, something in you is still paying attention, still sensing when something does not fully align, even if your mind cannot explain why. And that is where things start to shift, not in the obvious moments, not in the big decisions, but in these small, quiet interruptions that you almost ignore, but do not. Because something in you refuses to completely disconnect from what it is feeling, even when everything else tells you to move on. And what makes this even more confusing is that on the surface, nothing looks completely wrong. Your life has not fallen apart. There has been no clear sign telling you to stop or turn around, which is exactly why it is so hard to trust what you are feeling, because it is not loud enough to demand your attention. It is just there, quietly repeating itself in different ways, like a subtle echo you cannot ignore anymore. And you might have tried to override it, telling yourself to just keep going, to stop overthinking, to push past the hesitation and make something happen, because that is what you have always done. You move forward, you adapt, you do not wait for perfect clarity. But lately, that approach has not been working the same way. It feels like every time you try to force movement, something gently resists you. Not in a way that blocks you completely, but enough to slow you down, enough to make you question it. And that can be frustrating in a way that is difficult to explain, because it feels like you are doing everything right and still not getting the result you expected. And there was probably a moment not long ago when you sat there staring at a decision, maybe something simple on the outside, like replying to a message or committing to a plan, and you felt that hesitation again, that pause that does not come from fear exactly, but from something deeper, something that makes you feel like if you move too quickly, you might miss something important. And so you waited, even if just for a few seconds longer than usual. And in that space, nothing dramatic happened. No voice, no clear answer, just a quiet awareness that you were not supposed to rush it. And that kind of moment is easy to dismiss, because it does not come with proof. It does not give you a clear reason. It just asks you to trust something you cannot fully explain. And that is uncomfortable, especially if you are used to relying on logic, on plans, on visible progress. But the pattern keeps repeating, and the more it repeats, the harder it becomes to ignore that something is happening beneath the surface. Something that is not asking for your understanding first, but your attention. And maybe that is why the silence feels different now. It is not empty in the way it used to be. It feels like it is holding something, like there is a reason behind the stillness even if you cannot see it yet. And the truth is, most people do not stay in that space long enough to notice it. They move on too quickly. They fill the silence with distractions. They take the first available option just to escape the discomfort of waiting. But you did not fully do that. You hesitated, you paused, you noticed, and even if you did not understand why, you did not completely ignore it. And that matters more than you realize, because it means something in you is already responding to what is happening, even if your mind is still trying to catch up. And this is where the tension starts to build in a way you cannot ignore anymore. Because it is no longer just about small moments or passing thoughts. It begins to affect how you see everything, how you interpret every delay, every silence, every unexpected change. And you might notice yourself becoming more restless, checking things more often, looking for signs that something is finally going to move. Because part of you is tired of waiting without clear direction, tired of feeling like you are standing in between something that ended and something that has not fully begun yet. And that space can feel like the hardest place to be, because it offers no confirmation, no guarantee, just uncertainty stretched over time. And there was probably a moment recently when you almost broke that pattern, almost forced a decision just to escape that feeling. Maybe you were about to say yes to something that did not fully sit right, or maybe you were ready to go back to something you had already moved on from, just because it felt familiar, because at least it was something. And in that moment, it almost felt like relief, like you were finally taking control again. But then that same quiet resistance showed up, that same pause that does not shout, but does not disappear either. And it made you hesitate again. And that hesitation can feel frustrating, because it slows you down when all you want is movement, but at the same time it keeps you from stepping into something that does not fully align, even if you cannot explain why. And that creates an internal conflict that is hard to resolve, because one part of you wants clarity, wants progress, wants answers, while another part of you is holding back, sensing that something is not ready yet. And you are caught in between those two, trying to figure out which one to trust. And the longer this continues, the more intense it becomes, because it is not just about external situations anymore. It starts to feel personal, like something is being asked of you without being clearly stated, like you are being guided without being told where you are going. And that can make you question your own instincts, wondering if you are being too cautious or not cautious enough, if you are missing something obvious, or if you are actually noticing something others would overlook. And this is where most people give up, not because they are weak, but because this phase demands a kind of patience that does not come naturally. It asks you to stay present in uncertainty, to remain aware without immediate reward, to trust something you cannot fully see yet. And that is uncomfortable in a way that tests you quietly, because there is no clear finish line in sight. Just this growing awareness that something is building beneath the surface, something that has not revealed itself yet, but is already influencing your path in ways you are only beginning to notice. And somewhere in the middle of all this, there was a moment that stood out more than the others, not because it was obvious, but because it stayed with you longer than it should have. Like the time you were so close to committing to something. Maybe it looked right on paper. Maybe it even made sense logically. And for a second you convinced yourself that this was the step you had been waiting for, that this would finally break the pattern and move everything forward. And you can probably remember exactly how it felt in that moment. A mix of relief and urgency, like you did not want to overthink it this time, like you just wanted to say yes and be done with the waiting. But right before you moved forward, something inside you shifted again, not dramatically, just enough to make you pause. And that pause stretched longer than you expected, long enough for doubt to creep in, long enough for you to start questioning it again. And maybe you even got frustrated with yourself, wondering why you could not just go through with it. Why something so simple suddenly felt complicated. And eventually you stepped back, even if you did not fully understand why. And at the time it felt like you had just delayed yourself again, like you missed another chance, like you were the one holding yourself back. But what stayed with you was not the decision itself, it was the feeling, that quiet pull that made you stop, because it did not feel like fear. It felt like awareness, something deeper that did not need to explain itself to be felt. And that is what makes this different from all the other moments. Because you are starting to recognize a pattern not just in what is happening around you, but in how you are responding to it, how you are being slowed down in very specific ways at very specific times, and it is not random, even if it looks that way on the surface. And the more you think about it, the more you realize that every time something did not work out, every time something was delayed or shifted, there was always a moment right before it where you felt something similar, a hesitation, a pause, a sense that something was not fully aligned, even if everything else looked fine. And that realization can be unsettling, because it challenges the idea that you are just unlucky or out of sync. It suggests that something else has been quietly influencing your path, something that does not force you, does not stop you completely, but gently redirects you in ways that only make sense when you look back. And that is where the tension deepens even more, because now it is not just about what is happening, it is about what it might mean, and you are standing right at the edge of that understanding, not fully there yet, but close enough to feel that something important is about to be revealed. Something that could change the way you see everything that has happened up to this point, and this is usually the point, where everything inside you starts to feel heavier, not because something new happened, but because you are beginning to see too much at once. All the delays, all the missed moments, all the times you almost moved forward but did not. And it creates this quiet pressure that builds in the background, like you are carrying questions that refuse to settle. And there might have been a night recently when it felt like too much. When you sat there thinking about how long this has been going on, how many times you adjusted, how many times you told yourself to be patient, and for a moment you almost let go of all of it, not in a dramatic way, just a quiet decision inside your mind that maybe none of this meant anything. Maybe you were reading too deeply into things. Maybe it really was just random. And that thought can feel strangely comforting at first, because it removes the pressure of trying to understand. It gives you an easy explanation, but at the same time it does not fully sit right, because something in you resists that idea. Something in you knows that what you have been feeling is not just coincidence, even if you cannot prove it, and that creates a kind of internal conflict that is difficult to resolve, because now you are standing between two possibilities. One where everything is meaningless and you are simply overthinking, and another where something is actually happening but you cannot yet see the full picture. And choosing the first option feels easier, but it also feels incomplete, like ignoring a signal that keeps trying to get your attention. And that is where the tension reaches its peak, because you cannot go back to not noticing anymore. Once you have seen the pattern, once you have felt those moments of hesitation, once you have experienced that quiet pull that keeps showing up at the same time as these changes, you cannot fully dismiss it. And yet you still do not have a clear answer. You are still in that space where everything feels unfinished, and that can make you feel like you are stuck, like you are standing still while everything else moves around you. And maybe you even started comparing your path to others, wondering why things seem to flow for them while you keep encountering these pauses, these interruptions, these moments that slow you down just enough to make you question everything. And that comparison can make it even harder to trust what you are experiencing, because it makes your situation feel like an exception, like something is wrong. But what if it is not wrong? What if this is exactly where something shifts, not in a way that is obvious, not in a way that gives you immediate clarity, but in a way that forces you to stay in this moment just a little longer, because there is something here you are meant to recognize, something that cannot be rushed, something that only becomes clear when you stop trying to escape the discomfort of not knowing and start paying attention to what has been happening all along. Because you are closer than it feels, even if right now it still looks like nothing has changed. And here is where everything begins to shift, not outside of you, but in the way you understand what has been happening. Because what if none of those moments were random? What if every delay, every pause, every missed connection was not something going wrong, but something quietly being redirected? And the reason it felt confusing is because you were looking for forward movement when something else was happening beneath the surface, something that does not announce itself, something that does not explain itself in real time. And that is why it felt like silence instead of guidance. But think about it for a second. Every time you were about to step into something that did not fully align, there was always that hesitation, that pause you could not explain. And every time something did not work out, it happened in a way that pulled you away just enough, not completely blocking you, but shifting your direction slightly. And that is not how randomness works. Randomness does not repeat patterns with that kind of consistency. Randomness does not create the same feeling over and over again at the exact moment you are about to move forward. And maybe you did not see it then because you were too close to it, too focused on what you thought you were losing. But now as you look back, even just a little, you can start to see how each moment connects, how each delay led to another adjustment, how each interruption kept you from fully committing to something that was not meant to hold you long term. And there was probably something specific, something you really wanted at the time, something that felt like it would solve everything. And when it did not happen, it left you confused, maybe even disappointed, because you could not understand why it was taken away or why it never fully came through. But what you could not see then is that you were being guided out of something before it became something you would have to escape later. And that is the difference. One feels like loss in the moment. The other reveals itself as protection over time. And that realization does not come all at once. It comes in pieces, small connections forming as you begin to see the pattern more clearly. And it changes the way you interpret what is happening now. Because suddenly the silence does not feel empty. It feels intentional. The delays do not feel like punishment. They feel like timing. And the hesitation you have been feeling does not feel like weakness. It starts to feel like awareness, like something in you has been responding to something beyond what you can logically explain. And that does not mean you have all the answers yet. It just means you are beginning to see that there was a reason behind what felt like nothing. And that reason has been shaping your path this entire time without needing your understanding first. And this is the part that most people never fully understand, because it requires looking at your past differently than you ever have before, not through the lens of what you lost, but through the lens of what you were quietly moved away from. And that shift is not easy, because it means admitting that some of the things you held on to, some of the things you believed were meant for you, were never actually aligned in the way you thought. And there might have been a moment you remember clearly, something that felt like it should have worked out, maybe a connection, an opportunity, or a decision that seemed right at the time. And when it did not happen, it stayed with you, not just as disappointment, but as a question that never fully closed. And even now, if you think about it, there is a part of you that still wonders what would have happened if it had gone differently. But what if that question itself is part of the misunderstanding? What if the focus has never been on what could have happened, but on what was quietly prevented from happening? Because there is a difference between something being taken away and something being kept out of your path. And that difference is not always visible in the moment, especially when you are emotionally connected to the outcome. But over time, patterns reveal themselves. And when you start connecting those moments, you begin to see that certain things never fully came together. Not because you failed, not because you were not ready, but because they were never meant to fully take root in your life. And that realization can feel uncomfortable at first, because it challenges the narrative you have been holding on to, the idea that you missed something, that you were too late, that you were somehow out of sync. But what if you were not out of sync at all? What if you were being kept in sync with something you could not yet see, something that required you to not move forward at those exact moments, even if it did not make sense at the time? And there is something else you might notice when you reflect on those situations, something subtle but important. Every time something did not work out, every time something shifted or fell through, you were not completely unaware. There was always that feeling, that quiet signal that something was off. Something was not fully right, even if you could not explain it. And that means you were not just being redirected externally. You were also being guided internally. Your awareness was being sharpened in ways that you are only now beginning to recognize. And that is what changes everything. Because it means this has never been about random outcomes or missed chances. It has been about alignment, about being moved step by step into something that requires you to see differently, to trust differently, to respond differently. And that process does not happen all at once. It unfolds through moments like the ones you have been experiencing, moments that only make sense when you stop trying to force them into a timeline that was never meant to be followed in the first place. And once you begin to see it this way, something else starts to shift inside you, not suddenly, but gradually, like your mind is trying to catch up with something your intuition already recognized. And you may start replaying certain moments again, but this time from a different angle, not asking why it did not work out, but noticing what was happening around you at the time, the details you ignored before, the feeling you brushed aside, the subtle resistance you tried to push through. And when you look at it like that, the pattern becomes clearer because it was never just about what happened. It was about how consistently you were being guided away at very specific points. And there is probably one moment that stands out now more than before, something that once felt like a missed chance, but now feels different when you revisit it. Maybe it was a job you almost took, something that looked perfect on the surface, good pay, good timing, everything seemed to line up, and yet something in you hesitated, even when it made no logical sense. And you remember sitting there thinking you were overthinking it, thinking you just needed to commit and move forward. But something held you back just long enough. Maybe the offer changed, maybe communication slowed, maybe something small shifted that made it fall apart. And at the time it felt frustrating, like you lost something valuable. But now, looking back, you might notice things you did not see. Then, the parts that did not quite fit, the details that would have become problems later, the feeling that would not have gone away even if you had moved forward. And that is where the understanding deepens, because it shows you that what felt like a delay was actually a form of redirection, something subtle but precise, something that does not force your path, but influences it just enough to keep you aligned. And this is where the meaning of silence changes completely, because it is no longer something you interpret as absence. It becomes something that holds intention, something that allows things to unfold without interference. And that can be difficult to accept at first, because it requires letting go of the need for immediate answers, the need to see everything clearly before you trust it. But the truth is, you have already been experiencing this process. You have already been responding to it, even if you did not have the words for it. And now you are starting to recognize it for what it is, not as a series of random events, but as something structured, something intentional, something that has been shaping your direction quietly. And once you see that, even just a little, it becomes harder to go back to the old way of thinking, because now every delay, every pause, every unexpected shift carries a different meaning, not something to resist immediately, but something to observe, something to understand over time, because what you are in right now is not a stop. It is a transition, one that has been happening longer than you realized, and one that is beginning to reveal itself in ways that are becoming harder to ignore. And as this understanding settles in, something deeper begins to take shape, not just in how you interpret the past, but in how you experience the present, because you are no longer reacting to every delay the same way. You are starting to observe it, to sit with it a little longer, to notice what it brings up in you instead of immediately trying to fix it. And that shift may feel subtle, but it changes everything, because now you are not just moving through your life. You are becoming aware within it, aware of the patterns, aware of the timing, aware of the way certain things seem to align only after something else has been cleared out of the way. And there is a quiet strength in that awareness, even if it does not feel like strength at first, because it asks you to trust something that does not always give you instant clarity. It asks you to stay grounded even when things are not fully explained, and that is not easy, especially when you are used to measuring progress by visible results, by things happening in a way you can point to and understand. But this process does not always work like that. It works in layers, in shifts that happen internally before they ever show up externally. And you might start noticing that your reactions are changing, that moments which used to frustrate you now make you pause instead, that situations which once felt like setbacks now feel like signals, not always clear, but meaningful enough to pay attention to. And that does not mean everything suddenly makes sense. There are still moments where you question it, where you wonder if you are just trying to find meaning in something that might not be there. And that is part of it too. That back and forth, that internal dialogue between doubt and awareness. Because you are still learning how to trust what you are sensing, and that takes time. It takes experience. It takes seeing enough patterns repeat before you begin to accept that there is something consistent behind them. And as that acceptance grows, something else begins to shift, your sense of identity within this process. Because you are no longer just someone waiting for things to happen. You are someone who is being shaped by what is happening, even in the quiet, even in the delays, even in the moments that seem like nothing on the surface. And that realization can feel grounding in a way that is difficult to explain, because it removes the urgency to force outcomes. It allows you to be present in what is unfolding without needing to control every step. And that does not mean you stop moving forward. It means you move differently, with more awareness, with more sensitivity to the signals you once ignored. And that is where a deeper kind of clarity begins to form, not the kind that answers every question, but the kind that helps you recognize when something is aligned and when it is not, even before you have all the information. And that kind of clarity does not come from outside validation. It comes from the repeated experience of being guided in ways you did not understand at first, but are beginning to see more clearly now. And that is what has been developing in you this entire time, quietly, steadily, without needing to announce itself. And by now, something inside you has already begun to change, even if you have not fully put it into words yet, because you are no longer looking at your life the same way you were before. You are not chasing every open door with the same urgency. You are not reacting to every delay with the same frustration. And that shift is not something you forced. It happened quietly, through everything you have experienced up to this point. And you might start noticing that certain things no longer pull you the way they used to. Things that once felt urgent now feel distant. Things that once seemed necessary now feel optional. And that is not because you lost interest. It is because something deeper has been recalibrated within you. Something that is changing what you respond to and what you no longer chase. And this is where it becomes clear that this process was never just about external outcomes. It was about internal alignment, about reshaping the way you move through your own life. And there may have been a moment recently where you realized this without even trying. Maybe you were faced with a situation that in the past would have pulled you in immediately, something that looked like an opportunity or a familiar pattern. And instead of reacting the way you normally would, you paused, not out of fear, but out of awareness. And in that pause, you felt something different, a sense of distance, like you could see it more clearly without being pulled into it. And that moment might have surprised you, because it showed you that you are not the same person you were when all of this started. You are seeing things differently now, even if everything around you looks the same. And that is what this has been building toward, not just a change in circumstances, but a change in perception, a deeper awareness that allows you to recognize what is aligned and what is not before you fully step into it. And that awareness is something most people never develop, because they rush past these moments. They ignore the hesitation, they override the quiet signals. But you did not. Even when it was uncomfortable, even when it did not make sense, you stayed with it long enough for it to start forming into something real. And now you are beginning to see the result of that, not as a final answer, but as a shift in how you experience everything moving forward, because you are no longer just reacting to life as it happens. You are engaging with it in a more intentional way, even if that intention is still unfolding. And there is something important in that, something that does not need to be fully explained to be felt, because it shows that what you have been going through was not just about getting somewhere else. It was about becoming someone who can recognize the difference between what looks right and what actually is right. And that difference is what will shape everything that comes next, even if you cannot fully see it yet. And now, without needing everything to be fully explained, you can feel that something has already shifted in you, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet steadiness that was not there before, like you are no longer trying to force your way out of uncertainty, but instead you are standing within it differently, with a kind of awareness that does not panic the way it used to. And that does not mean you suddenly have all the answers, or that everything around you has changed overnight. It simply means you are no longer interpreting every delay as a loss or every silence as absence, because something in you understands now that not everything needs to move quickly to be meaningful. And there may still be moments where doubt shows up, where you question if you are reading too much into things, or if you should just move on and stop paying attention to these subtle signals. But even in those moments, there is a part of you that stays grounded, a part that remembers what you have already seen, what you have already felt, and how those moments that once seemed confusing now make more sense when you look back. And that is something you cannot unlearn, because it has already changed the way you see your own path. And maybe the most important part of all of this is not what is coming next, but how you are moving toward it now, not with urgency, not with fear of missing out, but with a quiet recognition that you are not as out of sync as you once thought, that you have not been left behind, that even in the moments where nothing seemed to be happening, something was still unfolding in ways you could not measure at the time. And that realization does not need to come with a final answer or a clear destination. It just needs to settle in enough for you to stop fighting the process you are already in, because the truth is, you have already been responding to it, even before you understood it. And now you are simply becoming aware of what has been there all along. And that awareness changes how you move forward, not by giving you control over everything, but by allowing you to trust what you sense without needing to prove it immediately. And maybe that is enough for now. Not a complete resolution, not a perfect explanation, but a quiet knowing that you are exactly where you need to be in this moment, even if you are still discovering why.